Hi, students. We're going ahead and continuing on with our general description of what we're doing so far in this class. And actually, this is the whole class in a nutshell. But we have this general method of analysis of the economic models that we're trying to learn. The first step is to find the relevant equilibrium, and the second step is to quantify the welfare effects. So we'll talk about quantifying welfare effects now. Okay, so this falls under this general heading of welfare analysis. Now, to distinguish it from what we've been doing before, so we're not just merely characterizing the equilibrium, which by characterizing the equilibrium, that's our step one, where we find a price and a quantity, for example, that would result from a competitive market equilibrium. Or the other type of equilibrium we talked about was some sort of price control policy, where you might have a price that's mandated by the government, and then you could characterize the resulting market outcome as an excess supply or an excess demand. But in addition to that, we use this concept of total surplus as a measure of the benefits from trading through a market. So I'll say a few words about that, which is just generally capturing the idea of what it means to benefit from trade through a market. The idea is that, and I think a perfect example is to consider clothes that people buy at the mall. Maybe you go to H&M or some other store and you buy your clothes. And you probably don't think about it because clothes are relatively inexpensive. And even if you think your clothes are expensive, I really want you to think about how much time it takes to earn the money to buy the clothes that you purchase. Because if you've ever made anything by hand, you know that every one of us is not skilled enough and doesn't have the right equipment at our disposal to make the clothing of the same quality, of the same materials, in anything that would approximate a reasonable amount of time. Making a simple T-shirt, imagine trying to actually, manufacture the cloth from raw cotton. How long would that take? It would take an impossible amount of time. So, so that's the time that you save that you would have had to spend if you would have done it yourself is one way to think about the gains from trading in a market. What happens in the market for clothing is clothing manufacturers are specialized in the production, in producing cloth and sewing it to specifications and using different materials and coloring it. So it's a nice finished product. And so their costs of doing that are relatively low, and most people have a relatively high, what we call willingness to pay for their product, at least relative to their costs. I mean, they might produce a garment for a couple dollars and people would buy it because they're willing to pay at least as much as the price is marked when they go to the shop in the mall, might pay $20 or $30 or $40 or more for that garment. So if you ask yourself why people are willing to pay $40 for something like that, a big part of the explanation is that they can't get it someplace else less expensively, and they're not going to make it themselves at home. And if you want to think about home production, where people decide maybe it's not worth it to pay the price that sellers are asking in the market, so you do it yourself at home. It might be cooking your own meals at home, or it might be when you decide to do some work on your house, build a fence, or repair your own car, or mow your own lawn, because you think, well, the amount of time it'll take me, and I have the equipment, it's not worth it to pay the market price. So you don't purchase that from a supplier in the market. So when you can purchase something in the market for less than you could do it yourself, or less than what you're willing to pay to do it yourself, then you end up um, getting a gain through participating in the market as a consumer. And sellers likewise, right? They can make lots of different things and do it relatively inexpensively, but they end up selling it in the market for some amount greater than their cost of production. So they get to take these relatively inexpensive materials and turn them into something that doesn't cost them that much to produce. And then they can sell it for more than their cost and generate a profit for themselves. So that's their gain from trading, is basically the increase in the profits that the market makes available to them by being able to trade with people in the market. So buyers and sellers both benefit from being in the market, and we can measure that, and you can kind of tell that it's going to be a dollar measure, because I've talked about, well, what's your willingness to pay for a good? Well, if you decide not to purchase it in the market, then you've got to think about your cost in terms of your time and other things like that. And sellers are going to think about, well, if they don't participate in the market, then they can avoid their costs, but they're going to give up profits. And again, profits are measured in terms of dollars too. So our measure of the gains from trade, we sometimes call it, which is the benefits from trading in the market, um, come in three components: consumer surplus, producer surplus, and the benefits to third parties. I'm not going to talk about the benefits to third parties too much, but just to give you a quick example, sometimes we know that things in the market are taxed by the government, and that generates tax revenue, and the tax revenue goes to pay for roadways and schools and other things that are a benefit to society more generally. So there are substantial third-party benefits too. But in most cases, we just focus our analysis on the two primary parties. Those are the main parties in a transaction in the market, which is just the buyers and the sellers. And then we split up this total surplus into the gains of trading to just buyers, which we call consumer surplus, and the gains from trading to sellers, which we call producer surplus, or PS. So we have consumer surplus and producer surplus most of the time. I just want to say one other thing really quickly, which is, don't confuse these dollar measures of surplus or benefits to consumers and producers with the idea of surplus when we're talking about a price floor and overproduction. It's unfortunate, but it's true that early on in the course, you're introduced to the idea that if there's a binding price floor, you can have a overproduction of the good or an oversupply, and they call that a surplus. They should just call it a quantity surplus, but they're using the term surplus very generally there. And then shortly after, we learn these concepts of consumer surplus and producer surplus, which are not at all related. Again, consumer and producer surplus are components of total surplus, which is this dollar measure of the gains from trading in the market. And the reason we use those is we're trying to come up with a dollar measure for how markets impact the welfare of society, and we call that welfare analysis. Again, you could get a little bit confused because a lot of times people hear the word welfare and they automatically think, oh, that's the government giving people who are needy money to help them live. And that is not the way in which we use the word welfare in economics. Remember, every discipline is riddled with jargon. There's tons of jargon in every discipline, and you have to be careful because once you go into that discipline, you're using language in a very specific way. And as long as you've been introduced to it, everybody is on the same page. But if you start to use general outside definitions for words that are defined specifically within the discipline that you're studying, you'll often make mistakes. So, so welfare is one example where you've got to be careful, because we mean the well-being of society, and we're going to use dollars to measure how the well-being of society is affected by having markets to trade goods and services. And again, our other example is it's easy to misunderstand what we mean by surplus here, which is a component of that measure that we've used. Okay, so let's continue on. Okay, so how do we measure consumer surplus? So I want you to pay attention to this. I want you to pay attention to this verbal definition over here because it's meant to describe the area that's highlighted in blue here. So its consumer surplus is measured by the area below the demand and above the price consumers pay and to the left of the quantity purchased. And that's at any given price. So in this example here, it's supposed to be a price of $20. And then that point on the demand curve is associated with a quantity of 14 units. That would be the quantity demanded. It's what consumers want to purchase if they face the price of $20. And so this highlighted area in blue is, yeah, it's the area that's below the demand curve, above the price consumers are paying, and to the left of the quantity that they would purchase. And then notice it's a triangle. And I also want to point out, you guys will see, I'm going to do another example in just a minute, that these areas aren't always triangles. A lot of people get fooled and they think, oh, it's got to be a triangle. And in fact, in a lot of common cases it is, and in some other equally common cases it's not a triangle. So just be careful. Whatever price the consumer's facing, you look at the quantity that they would purchase, and then you look at the area below the demand curve, and that's going to be some shape. And if you calculate the area of that shape, it's going to give you a number, and the dollar value of that number is consumer surplus. I should say I said dollar value, but it's just important to notice that when you have units, it's like you purchase 14 units for $20 a piece. Well, you've got units times dollars, and the result is your total spending. It's in dollars. So consumer surplus, because we have prices here on the vertical axis, consumer surplus is going to be measured in terms of dollars too. Now, what about producer surplus? Well, producer surplus, there's a verbal definition for that too. And it's also measured by an area, and it's the area above the supply curve, below the price that sellers receive, and to the left of the quantity sold. So again, I can measure the producer surplus associated with any price by just looking at that price, looking at the quantity supplied at that price, and then looking at the area above the supply curve and below the price and to the left of that quantity. And again, here it ends up being the shape of a triangle too. And don't be fooled, because lots of times it's not a triangle, but it always is above the supply curve, below the price, and to the left of the quantity. And if you have those three things, the area that you're describing might not be a triangle. So just be careful. So here's an example of total surplus for a competitive equilibrium. And notice we have our two triangles. We have consumer surplus and we have producer surplus. And this is the reason why this is one of the first examples that people see. And so they get it stuck that, oh, they're supposed to be triangles. And you'll see in a moment, they're not. But notice, to calculate the area of these triangles, right, we need to use the triangle area formula, which is 1/2 the base times the height. Well, the base of this triangle is this line here, the arrow. So at a price of 10, you get a quantity of 17. But notice you would measure the length of this base, because it's a horizontal line, by the units on the horizontal axis, which are quantity units, right? So the length of this line from the vertical axis to the equilibrium point can be measured by this parallel distance from the origin to the um, equilibrium quantity. So you go from 0 to 17. This line on the horizontal axis, or the segment of the horizontal axis, has a length of 17. It's the exact same distance as the distance from the equilibrium point to the vertical axis. Those are parallel lines. They have the same length. So, are parallel lines with the same length. So the base is going to be 17. So I have 1/2 times 17. And then notice the vertical distance for consumer surplus is the distance between where the demand curve hits the vertical axis. That's the vertical intercept of the line, right? And I labeled it as 30, and the equilibrium price. So the vertical distance is from 30 to 10 on the vertical axis. That's the height of the triangle. And so I have 1/2, 17, that's the base, times 30 minus 10, which we know is going to be a distance of 20 units on the vertical axis. So it's 1/2 times 17 times 20. Half of 20 is 10. So we know this is going to be $170 worth of consumer surplus. So that's how we measure the gains of participating in this market for consumers as a group together, or if this was one consumer's demand curve, then for that particular consumer. Okay, and producer surplus is similarly measured. So again, we can look at the base of this triangle. Now, you got to be kind of good at flipping triangles around and reorienting them, but you should see that the base is also this distance from the vertical axis to the equilibrium point. And so it has the same distance. It's the same length as before. So we have 1/2, 17. And in this case, the height, right, goes from 10 to 2. So 10 minus 2 is 8. And 1/2 times 17 times 8 is 68. So there's $68 worth of producer surplus as represented by this pink area. And then total surplus, in this case, it's consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So 170 plus 68 is $238 worth of total surplus. Those are the total gains from trade. It's our measure of the benefit to society of having this market. And you might say, like, well, why do we want to measure the benefit to society from having this market, this competitive market in trading? Well, because sometimes markets are banned and the government just makes it illegal for everybody to participate in a market. So, and most of the times that happens, it's a market that has some, obvious issues with it that have brought it a lot of negative political attention. So maybe, for example, the market for automatic weapons might be one that's banned. But while the market's still active, you can still ask the question, oh, well, how would we measure the total benefits from having that market existing? So when we ban it, we know what was lost in terms of economic value. Not that there might be other good reasons for doing it and banning the sale of a particular good, but yeah, the economic analysis is one part of the puzzle. You want to know what's the value of those market transactions in lots of different contexts, but that's just one example for public policy. Okay, so now here's our other example. It's the one we were using before, example for calculating welfare with a price ceiling. So now notice we have consumer surplus, and Oh, okay. Oh, I lost my picture. Let's see. Okay, my picture's back. So, but here, if we go back to our verbal definition, so for consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve, above the price consumers pay, and to the left of the quantity purchased. So again, we go the area below the demand curve and above the price consumers pay. Now that there's a price ceiling, I'm indicating the price ceiling as being $5 here. And here's the point on the demand, or excuse me, the point where the price ceiling intersects with the supply curve, and that's going to be the quantity traded. Remember, when there's a price ceiling, there's a shortage. So we indicated this other point here where the price ceiling intersects with the demand curve, but that's how much consumers want to purchase. But sellers only want to sell this smaller amount. And again, based on the way that we've defined this policy, there's no ability to force the sellers to sell if they don't want to. A simple price ceiling is just the government coming in and saying the price can't be any higher than $5. Now everybody behave as they want to according to that regulation. And in that sort of situation, if the government sets a price of $5 as being the maximum price, sellers will want to only sell 10 units. So sure, there's a shortage, and you can see the shortage is the distance between where the pricing intersects with the demand curve and the supply curve. But for our analysis at this point, right, we're focusing in on the welfare effects. We're not so interested in characterizing um, the shortage and characterizing the equilibrium itself. We just want to use some of the elements of that equilibrium characterization to do our welfare analysis. So they're going to be 10 units that are sold, and they're going to sell for a price of $5. Now you might wonder, well, why do I have the $20 here? And I'll tell you in just a minute. But the area below the demand curve and above the price that consumers pay, which is $5, and to the left of the quantity purchased, is that all of this blue area, which is actually, I don't know if you guys can recognize it if you reoriented it, it's a trapezoid. And so we would have to use a trapezoid formula. Now, a trapezoid is composed of a rectangle here and a triangle. And you can calculate the rectangle and triangle areas separately and add them together to get the total area. But this is such a common calculation that it's easier to just use the formula for a trapezoid if you remember it. And I'll show you that formula in just a minute. I also want to highlight the pink area, which is the producer surplus. And notice again, if we go back to our verbal definition, it's the area above the supply curve, below the price that the sellers receive, and to the left of the quantity sold. So to the left of this point, and it's that pink area. So we can go through our calculations. So the trapezoid formula is you take both of the bases, their lengths, and you add them up, because the trapezoid has two bases. I'll try to draw you guys a quick trapezoid here. There's a short base and a long base, and so this is a trapezoid. Okay, and so you have one of the bases here and another base here, and then the height of the trapezoid is the distance between the two bases. So it's that distance there. Okay. Well, in our case, if we go back to consumer surplus, and again, now let's look at this trapezoid. This is a particular type of trapezoid. You can see there's a big trapezoid here that looks like the one that I just drew, but this smaller blue trapezoid is a right trapezoid. So one of the bases kind of looks like a square. But we have this base, the shorter base, and and then we have this longer base here. And that's why I have this number 20 indicated. So notice the point that represents where the price ceiling intersects with the supply curve. It gives us the quantity that's going to be purchased. And so we can take that quantity and we can look at the point on the demand curve associated with that quantity, and then we can go over and find the resulting price that corresponds to the price that, if there was no price ceiling regulation, if consumers faced a price of $20 in the market, they would choose to only purchase 10 units. They don't have to pay this price, but it helps us measure the lengths of the two bases. So this long base has a length from where the demand curve intersects with the vertical axis, which is at a price of 30 based on our diagram. So we go from 30 to 5, and that's one of the bases. So 30 minus 5, that distance is a length of 25 along this long edge or this long base. And then the shorter base has a distance from 20 to 5. So 20 minus 5 is 15, and that's the distance along this smaller base. So if we go back to our formula, sure enough, we have 25 plus 15 times a half, and then times 10. Well, I said the distance between the two bases was the height of the trapezoid, or sometimes you call it the altitude. Well, you can see that, again, looking at base 1 and base 2, the distance between them can be measured here along the horizontal axis as the distance from 0 to 10, which is the quantity that's bought and sold in the market. So sure enough, so we have 25 plus 15 times a half times 10, which is the distance between the two bases in our case. And so this would be 40 times a half, which is 20 times 10, and the consumer surplus, that blue trapezoid, is an area of 200, and then we put dollars in front of it because we're interpreting it in terms of dollars of gains from trade. And for producer surplus, it's just a triangle again. And then notice for this pink triangle, the base is a length of 10, and the height of the triangle is the distance between the price ceiling price and where the supply curve hits the vertical axis, and that's 5 minus 2 is 3. So we've got 1/2 times 10 times 5 minus 2, which is 1/2 times 10 times 3, which is $15 worth of producer surplus, and our total surplus then would be $215. So those are our two examples, and that's the way that you would go through the analysis. Okay, so I will see you guys soon.